Split Fiction is the latest game from Hazelight, the guys that made It Takes Two, the game that won Game of the Year back in 2021. Much deservedly, shall I say, because I think that game was fantastic, but that means expectations are really, really high this time around for Split Fiction. I played this through on PlayStation 5 couch co-op mode with my wife Nikki, who I also played It Takes Two with, so we had a pretty good feeling for how these games tend to flow and work. In case you're not familiar with these games, they are entirely designed for cooperative play, meaning that you either sit on the couch with a friend or family member or whatever, or you play online remotely using a friend pass, meaning only one player has to actually own a copy of the game in order for both people to play it, which is really cool. And we loved It Takes Two. It was my Game of the Year back in 2021 as well as the Game Awards one, and it's because the game was fantastic. And the reason these games really excel is because each and every single chapter is punctuated by a shift in gameplay. One level might have one gameplay system or mechanic for the entire level, and then the next level has a totally different gameplay system that you have to completely relearn and refocus. And simply, if I had to explain how Hazelight makes games, is that they just overwhelm you with their creativity. Just when you think they've run out of ideas, they throw 15 more at you. It's humbling, frankly, to see just how many clever ideas and inversions of what you might expect to see are present here. It's phenomenal, and it makes it look like there's no creativity anywhere else in the industry because this game is just overflowing with it, just like It Takes Two was. But having said that, Split Fiction is a very different game than It Takes Two, and I think it's important to understand that. If you go into this game expecting It Takes Two, you're gonna be disappointed because Split Fiction is much more serious. It's exploring much more serious topics. It's way less goofy, and while there are moments of levity here and there, it's far more real. The two protagonists, Mio and Zoe, are very different people. Mio focused on sci-fi and action stories as a writer, and Zoe is a writer focused on fantasy and stories about coming together. And they each have reasons for being the way that they are, for talking the way they do, and for writing the stories that they do. And as the game goes on and you explore these different stories that each character has written, but together, you start to learn a lot about them, and you explore these traumas with the characters to help them overcome those scarring events. Again, I'm trying to be vague so I don't spoil anything, but it's well written. It's just much more serious than It Takes Two, where you play it as a couple little puppets being kind of silly, trying to repair your relationship together with the Book of Love hanging out. I mean, this guy.
Yes! Where are they? Yeah!
There's nothing like that in the game, okay? So if you're expecting that level of silliness and you're hoping to get that out of this game, you're gonna be disappointed. But that doesn't mean that Split Fiction is bad. In fact, I think Split Fiction is really, really good. I just think that it's a big shift from the game that they did last time that we all know very well and love dearly, which is why I'm trying to set expectations just so you don't expect something that this game isn't trying to do. But to summarize my thoughts very quickly, just in case you don't have time to watch the whole video, I will simply say that Split Fiction is great, but it's a slow burn and it's much more serious, especially towards the end, than It Takes Two ever was. That doesn't mean that it's bad, but it does mean that it's a lot less goofy. And if you were hoping to get goofy out of this game, you're just not going to. You're going to get something else that's, in my opinion, just as good, if not better in some cases, but you need to go into it with the proper expectations. In this video, I'm going to explain some of those expectations. I'm going to explain some of what this game does so well, and also some of the shortcomings, because there are a couple of little things that I was frustrated by, and a couple of things that I think could potentially serve as roadblocks for some players. But don't worry, I'm going to steer clear of spoilers. Everything that we're going to show and talk about in this video is not a spoiler, so rest assured, you can watch the review and not worry about anything being ruined. With that said, I don't have a sponsor or anything in this video, but if you enjoy it, consider subscribing. And I also started a newsletter, which you can subscribe to in my link tree. All you have to do is put in your email address, and then every week I send you an email with gaming news roundups and thoughts on something that happened in the industry. Super chill, super easy. It's just something me and my team are doing to try and stay more in tune with you guys. So if you're interested in a free newsletter that yours truly makes, check it out. Again, in the link tree. But anyway, to the point, Split Fiction. As I mentioned at the top, you play as Mio and Zoe. Mio is focused on sci-fi and action stories and is trying to get published, as is Zoe, who rather focuses on fantasy and stories about coming together to overcome challenges. They've traveled to a company run by a guy named Raider, who is offering the chance for them to get their stories published, but they soon realize that their stories are actually going to be stolen by him and sold off as part of the big corporate machine that he runs, using a machine kind of like an animus that will steal their creativity directly out of their minds, copying all of their stories onto their servers. And I'm sure this theme of corporations stealing creativity is one that hits a little close to home for many game developers who worked on this project, but you know what? Maybe that just made it all the easier to get into the project because it hit close to home. But to avoid spoiling anything, basically the two characters, Mio and Zoe, end up in the same pod, meaning that they're going to explore these stories that each of them have written together. And they have to try to get to the end of each individual story in order to break free from this situation they've found themselves in. And while doing that, they also become close friends and also learn to deal with their traumas that have been holding them back from greatness for all these years. Similar to It Takes Two, each of these stories or chapters has its own gameplay system tied to it, whether that's a dragon on your back or it's something like using gravity controlled boots and laser swords through a sci-fi story. There are also small side stories, such as this one you might have seen in some of the trailers, where you actually play as pigs running through a picnic by a farm, which initially sounds really wholesome until you see how the story inevitably ends, which frankly shouldn't be too surprising, but just reinforces how crazy these games can be, because you play as two little piggies and then you slide into the picnic basket and you play the next part as two sausages, and you can even go and like climb up onto the grill and get yourself nice and crispy if you want to. And that's what a lot of people love about these Hazelight games, is that they're just outrageous and silly and goofy and spilling with creativity. It's just wild, you know? But that's why so many of us love these games. And a lot of that is still present in Split Fiction. But this silliness is mostly relegated to these side stories, of which there's not an insane amount. There's maybe one or two for each individual chapter. Contrast that with It Takes Two, when there were a bunch of smaller or mini things to engage with, such as mini games for snowball fights or ice skating and curling and things like that. So there's a lot fewer mini games in this game, but there's larger side quests that have their own gameplay mechanics in them, some of them taking 5 minutes to 20 or 30 minutes to get through. And I don't think one way or the other is necessarily better. I think they're just different. And I'm guessing the reason they went with more of the side story, side quest structure for this game is because it was much less interruptive to the pace of each individual chapter's story, because if they were to sprinkle in a bunch of mini stuff, it might interfere with the pacing of the dialogue and the tone, especially because some of the later sections are much darker in tone. So it wouldn't really make sense to just start having like a little bitty snowball fight while dealing with something really intense. So I think that's why they did it, and I think it's a fair change. Another change is the chemistry between the characters. You see, Mio and Zoe start the game as total strangers, meaning they don't know each other at all. That's reflected in the dialogue for the first couple of hours of the game. It takes a little while for them to loosen up with each other, specifically Mio loosening up towards Zoe. For me, this meant that the first couple of hours of the game felt really standoffish, a little awkward. The dialogue didn't really flow quite right because the characters weren't comfortable with each other, which was a big change of pace compared to It Takes Two, where obviously you're talking about two people that are very intimately familiar with each other, a husband and wife couple that are trying to repair their relationship. And so Split Fiction is a game that, in my opinion, is a much slower burn. The first few hours I wasn't really in love with. The middle of the game I started to really like, and then the finale I thought was phenomenal. And speaking of phenomenal, there are some massive set pieces in this game that have been done as love letters to other games. There's one section later in the game which specifically made me think of old school God of War games. I'm not going to show it on screen because it's like one of the coolest things I've seen in gaming this year. But seriously, like they do a lot of stuff, especially towards the end of Split Fiction, that will just melt your brain. In fact, the final chapter, they do something which I honestly don't know how they're even doing it. Like, it doesn't make sense to me from my understanding of game development how this should be possible. It melts my brain, and even looking back at the footage while like preparing the outline for this review, I still am not totally sure how they would even begin to do this. So it's really, really impressive and very, very cool. And almost single-handedly makes the game like, yeah, you gotta play this. The final chapter is crazy. Like, it's so good. And while speaking of good, I think it's also important to note that for me, I felt the pacing was really, really solid. Sometimes with games like these that are built around mini games or side activities that have their own unique gameplay systems or mechanics, it can be really easy to focus too long on one mechanic or too short on a really fun one. But this time around, it feels like just when you were starting to feel like you were done with a certain type of gameplay, they would pivot and give you something else to try. In fact, in the entirety of our time with Split Fiction, me and my wife can only think of one mini gameplay system that we didn't like, which was this weird pinball mini game within a larger boss fight. And it lasted maybe all of 5 minutes. And it's just because for us, with my like capture device, we had a little bit of added latency while we were playing. And it made it really hard to get like the actual, I don't know, whackers. What do you call it in pinball? I don't know. It made it really hard to get those to move exactly when you wanted to, and it made the whole section way more difficult. But even that is an instance of something that was specific to us because of the capture card. It probably wasn't even the game. You know, you playing through this, you might not even be bothered by that because you wouldn't have the added latency. But in the entirety of the game, only having one thing like that we were kind of like, okay, let's calm down. I think that's a strong testament to the pacing and how carefully they managed player time within each of these encounters. I remember in It Takes Two, there were multiple levels where I was like, can we wrap it up? Whereas in this game, I never felt that. One thing I did feel though was frustration at one point because later in the game, I did run into the only technical issue I ran into in the entirety of my time with the game. As I said, I played the game on PlayStation 5 with my wife in couch co-op mode. We didn't have any technical issues. The game ran great, no frame dips. Like it was very, very impressively well optimized and set up. But we did run into one encounter towards the end of the game at the end of a character arc for one of the two protagonists. During this boss fight, there's a moment where it tells you after a checkpoint, it's like checkpoint, little bitty 2-3 second cutscene, and then you're supposed to mash triangle. We would do this and fail the check every single time, no matter what we did. And we started thinking we're going crazy. Like we haven't failed any other button mash QuickTime event through the entire game. What is happening? So we thought maybe this is something where we're just not fast enough or whatever it is. So we went into the accessibility options and you actually have an opportunity to change it to hold, where you hold triangle instead of button mashing it. Makes it way more approachable and accessible for people that can't button mash very quickly. So we changed it to that and tried holding down triangle and we still failed. And to be clear, this is a situation where if you fail the check, you get like stabbed with a sword and it's a fail state, you reload to the checkpoint. And if you pass, you're supposed to like flip the sword and stab the boss, right? Pretty standard. And we just kept failing and getting stabbed and forced to reload every single time. So then we went back into the accessibility options and there was an option that they give you to automatically pass QuickTime events, where basically the game button mashes for you and you will always succeed the check. We changed it to auto succeed and still failed. Like we're trying to hold the sword back and every single time we get stabbed, even with the auto pass. And weirdly, when we changed it back to button mash and then intentionally didn't touch our controllers to fail the check, we then passed the check and stabbed the boss. So I think somebody like in the code, it's a -1 instead of a 1, or it's an exclamation point when there's not supposed to be one in the code. There's something like that going on where for us, we had to fail the check in order to pass the check. And it wasn't like a cool Senua's Saga thing where it's like, oh, you have to give up and give in. It wasn't like that. The check was just bugged. And even when we reloaded the game on PS5, even when I rebooted the entire console, we still had the issue if we went back to that checkpoint which was just really weird. So I'm telling you this because it's the only problem we ran into in our entire time with the game, the 13 plus hours we played it. And who knows, maybe if you play it and you run into the same problem, you can intentionally fail and then pass. Problem solved. But having said that, the game ran very, very well. It was really well polished and optimized. It looked beautiful. And having the opportunity to swap between sci-fi and fantasy levels every chapter was nice and offered a good change of pace. Just when you were starting to get frustrated with the non-stop steel and laser beams, they would give you the opportunity to explore a forest with dragons or as a gigantic ape. But at the end of the day, Split Fiction for me was a game that I started off not loving, but by the end of it, I was thoroughly impressed and frankly had my mind melted. I don't think it's going to be as beloved as It Takes Two because it's not as silly, it's not as goofy and funny. It's just very different. But I think the people that do play it are going to have a much more impactful experience and are also going to be thoroughly impressed by some of what they do. It's just a different game than I was expecting it to be. And in some ways, I think it's a much better game than I expected it to be. And without a doubt, I can easily recommend it to you, especially if you have somebody in your life you played It Takes Two with and you want to play through the next game by this company. I think this is an easy recommend. Just go into it with the understanding that this is not for the faint of heart. It's a little bit more challenging. It's darker and a little bit more serious, and it deals with some more intense subject matter. So buckle up for that. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, again, subscribe, check out my newsletter below, like the video if you enjoyed it, and let me know if you're going to be trying Split Fiction when it launches on the 6th. But with all that said, thank you for watching. I love you all, and I'll see you in the next one. Hugs and kisses. Bye-bye.